Advanced praise for moonwalking with Einstein. You have to love a writer who employs chick sexting to help him explain human memory. Foyer is a charming and crackling mind, a fresh wind. He approaches a complex topic with so much humanity, humor, and originality that you don't realize how much you're taking in and understanding. It's kind of miraculous. By Mary Roach, author of Packing for Mars, Bonk, Spook, and Stiff. In this marvelous book, Joshua Foyer invents a new genre of nonfiction. This is a work of science journalism wrapped around an adventure story. A Bildungsroman fused to a vivid investigation of human memory. If you want to understand how we remember and how we all can learn to remember things better, then read this book. Jonah Lehrer, author of How We Decide, and Proust was a neurologist. Contributing editor, Wired. Joshua Foyer provides what few of us are willing to get our heads around. There's more room in our brains than we ever imagined. Moonwalking with Einstein isn't a how-to guide to remembering a name or where you put your keys. It's a riveting exploration of mankind's century-old obsession with memory, and one man's improbable quest to master his own. Stephen Facets, author of A Few Seconds of Panic and World Freak. Moonwalking with Einstein, The Art and Science of Remembering Everything by Joshua Foyer. That's the cover. Like the little dinosaur going through the door. Moonwalking with Einstein isn't just a splendid overview of an essential aspect of our humanity, our memory. It is also a witty, engaging account of how Foyer went from being a guy with an average memory to winning the U.S. Memory Championship. Dan Arley, author of The Upside of Irrationality and Predictability, Irrational, professor of behavioral economics at Duke University. On average, people squander 40 days annually, compensating for things they've forgotten. Joshua Foyer used to be one of those people. But after a year of memory training, he found himself in the finals of the U.S. Memory Championship. Even more important, Foyer found a vital truth we often forget. In every way that matters, we are the sum of our memories. Moonwalking with Einstein draws on cutting-edge research, a surprising cultural history of memory, and venerable tricks of the mentalist trade to transform our understanding of human remembering. Under the tutelage of top mental athletes, Foyer learns ancient techniques once employed by Cicero to memorize his speeches, and by medieval scholars to memorize entire books. Using methods that have been largely forgotten, he discovers that we can all dramatically improve our memories. Immersing himself obsessively in a quirky subculture of competitive memorizers, Foyer learns to apply techniques that call on imagination as much as determination, showing that memorization can be anything but rote. From the PAO system, which covers numbers into lucid images, into memory plate palace, in which memories are stored in the rooms of imaginary structures. 4 years' experience shows that the memory championships are less of a test of memory than of perseverance and creativity. Let's dive in. Moonwalking with Einstein. The Art and Science of Remembering Everything by Joshua Foer. The Penguin Press, New York, 2011. For Dinesh, everything. Contents. The smartest man is hard to find. The man who remembered too much. The expert. The most forgetful man in the world. The memory palace. How to memorize a poem. The end of remembering. The OK plateau. The talented 10th. The little rain man in all of us. The U.S. Memory Championship. Epilogue, acknowledgments, note, biography, index. Moonwalking with Einstein. There were no other survivors. Family members arriving at the scene of the 5th century BC banquet hall catastrophe pawed at the debris for signs of their loved ones, rings, sandals, anything that would allow them to identify their kin for proper burial. Minutes earlier, the Greek poet Simonides of Cleos had stood to deliver an ode in celebration of Scopas, the Thessalian nobleman. As Simonides sat down, a messenger tapped him on the shoulder. 2 young men on horseback were waiting outside, anxious to tell him something. He stood up again and walked out the door. At the very moment he crossed the threshold, the roof of the banquet hall collapsed in a thundering plume of marble shards and dust. He stood now before a landscape of rubble and entombed bodies. The air, which had been filled with boisterous laughter moments before, was smoky and silent. Teams of rescuers set to work frantically, digging through the collapsed building. The corpses they pulled out of the wreckage were mangled beyond recognition. No one could even say for sure who had been inside. One tragedy compounded another. Then something remarkable happened that would change forever how people thought about their memories. Simonides sealed his senses into the chaos around him and reversed time in his mind. The piles of marble returned to pillars, and the scattered friezes fragments reassembled in the air above. The stone were scattered in the debris, reformed into bowls. The splinters of wood poking above the ruins once again became a table. Simonides caught a glimpse of each of the banquet guests at his seat, carrying on oblivious to the impending catastrophe. He saw Scopas laughing at the head of the table, a fellow poet sitting across from him, sponging up the remnants of his meal with a piece of bread, a nobleman smirking. He turned to the window and saw the messengers approaching, as if with some important news. Simonides opened his eyes. He took each of the hysterical relatives by the hand, carefully stepping over to the debris, guided them one by one to the spots in the rubble where their loved ones had been sitting. At that moment, according to legend, the art of memory was born. It doesn't say chapters, it goes by 1. The smartest man is hard to find. Dom DeLuise, celebrity fat man, and 5 of clubs, has been implicated in the following unseemly acts in my mind's eye. He has hooked a fat globule of spittle, 9 of cubs, on Albert Einstein's thick white mane, 3 of diamonds, and delivered a devastating karate kick, 5 of spades, to the groin of Pope Benedict, the 6 of diamonds. Michael Jackson, King of Hearts, has engaged in behavior bizarre even for him. He has defecated 2 of clubs on a salmon, salmon burger, King of Clubs, and captured his flatulence, Queen of Cubs, in a balloon, 6 of spades. Rhea Pullman, diminutive Cheers bartendress, the Queen of Spades, has been caught cavorting with the 7'7" Sundancy baseball star Manute Bol, 7 of clubs, in a highly explicit, and in this case, automatically improbable, 2-digit act of Congress, 3 of cubs. This twardy tableau, which I'm not proud to commit to the page, goes a long way towards explaining the unlikely spot I find myself in at the moment. Sitting to my left is Ram Colley, an unshaven 25-year-old business consultant from Richmond, Virginia, who is defending United States champion memory champion. To my right is the muzzle of a television camera from a national cable network. Spread out behind me, where I can't see them, and they can't disturb me, are about 100 spectators and a pair of TV commentators offering play-by-play analysis. One is blow-dried veteran boxing announcer named Kenny Reese, whose gravely bedtime voice can't conceal the fact that he seems bewildered by this jamboree of nerds. The other is Peely of U.S. Memory Sport, a bearded 43-year-old chemical engineer and 4-time national champion from Fayetteville, North Carolina, named Scott Hagwood. In the corner of the room sits the object of my affection, a kitschy 2-tiered trophy consisting of a silver hand with gold nail polish brandishing a royal flush, and in a patriotic flourish 3 bald eagles perched just below. It's nearly as tall as my 2-year-old niece, and lighter than most of her stuffed animals. The audience has been asked to take any flash photographs and to maintain. The audience has been asked not to take any flash photographs and to maintain total silence. Not that Ram or I possibly hear them. Both of us are wearing earplugs. I've also got on a pair of industrial-strength earmuffs that look like they belong on an aircraft carrier deckhand. Because in the heat of a memory competition, there is no such thing as deaf enough. My eyes are closed. On a table in front of me, laying face down between my hands, are 2 shuffled decks of playing cards. In a moment, the chief arbiter will click a stopwatch, and I will have 5 minutes to memorize the order of both decks. The unlikely story of how I ended up in the finals of the U.S. Memory Championship. Stock still and sweating profusely begins a year earlier on a snowy highway in central Pennsylvania. I had been driving from my home in Washington, D.C. to the Lehigh Valley to do an interview for Discover magazine with a theoretical physicist at Kutztown University who has invented a vacuum chamber device that was supposed to pop the world's largest popcorn. My route took me through York, Pennsylvania, home of the Weightlifting Hall of Fame and Museum. I thought that sounded like something I didn't want to die without having seen, and I had an hour to kill. As it turned out, the Hall of Fame was little more than a sterile collection of old photographs and memorabilia displayed on the ground floor of the corporate offices of the nation's largest barbell manufacturer. Museology, it was crap. But it's where I first saw a black and white photo of Joe, the mighty atom. Grinstein, a hulking 5'4" Jewish-American strongman, who had earned his nickname in the 1920s by performing such inspiring feats as biting quarters in half and lying on a bed of nails while a 14-man Dixieland band played on his chest. He once challenged all 4 tires on a car without any tools. He once changed all 4 tires on a car without any tools. A caption next to the photo billed Greenstein as the strongest man in the world. Staring at that photo, I thought it would be pretty interesting if the world's strongest person ever got to meet the world's smartest person. The mighty Atom and Einstein, arms wrapped around each other, an epic juxtaposition of muscle and mind. A neat photo to hang above my desk, at least. I wondered if it had ever been taken. When I got home, I did a little Googling. The world's strongest person was pretty easy to find. His name was Maruzi Pudzianowski. He lived in Białowieża, Poland, and could deadlift 924 pounds, about 30 of my nieces. The world's smartest person, on the other hand, was not so easily identified. I typed in, highest IQ. Intelligence champion, smartest in the world. I learned that there was someone in New York City with an IQ of 228 and a chess player in Hungary who once played 52 simultaneous blindfolded games. There was an Indian woman who could calculate the 23rd root of a 200-digit number in her head in 50 seconds, and someone else who could solve a 4-dimensional Rubik's Cube, whatever that is. And of course, there were plenty of more obvious Stephen Hawking's types of candidates. Brains are notoriously trickier to quantify than brawn. In the course of my Googling, though, I did discover one intriguing candidate who was, if not the smartest person in the world, at least some kind of freakish genius. His name was Ben Pridmore, and he could memorize the precise order of 1,528 random digits in an hour. And to impress those of us with a more humanist bent, any poem handed to him. He was the reigning world memory champion. Over the next few days, my brain kept returning to Ben Pridmore's. My own memory was average at best. Among the things I regularly forgot, where I put my car keys, where I put my car for that matter, the food in the oven, that it's, and not it's. That it's and not it's. There's a spelling difference there. My girlfriend's birthday or anniversary, Valentine's Day, and clearance of the doorway to my parents' cellar. Ouch. My friends' phone numbers, why I just opened the fridge to plug in my cell phone, the name of President Bush's chief of staff, the order of the New Jersey Turnpike's rest stops, which year the Redskins last won the Super Bowl, to put the toilet seat down. Ben Pridmore, on the other hand, could memorize the order of shuffled decks of playing cards in 32 seconds. In 5 minutes, he could permanently commit to memory what happened on 96 different historical dates. The man knew 50,000 digits of pi. What was not to envy? I had once read that the average person squanders about 40 days a year compensating for things he or she has forgotten. Putting aside for a moment the fact that he was temporarily unemployed, how much more productive must Ben Pridmore be? Every day there seems to be more to remember. More names, more passwords, more appointments. With a memory like Ben Pridmore's, I'd imagine life would be quantitatively different and better. Our culture consistently inundates us with new information, and yet our brains capture so little of it. Most just goes in one ear and out the other. If the point of reading were simply to retain knowledge, it would probably be the single least efficient activity I engage in. I can spend half dozen hours reading a book, and then have only a foggy notion of what it was about. All those facts and anecdotes even the stuff interesting enough to be worth underlining, have a habit of briefly making an impression on me and then disappearing into the who knows where. There are books on my shelf that I can't even remember whether I've read or not. What would it mean to have all that otherwise lost knowledge at my fingertips? I couldn't help but think that it would make me more persuasive, more confident, and in some fundamental sense, smarter. Certainly, I'd be a better journalist, friend, and boyfriend. But more than that, I'd imagine that having a memory like Ben Pridmore's would make me an altogether more authentic, perhaps even wiser, an attentive person. To that extent, that experience is the sum of our memories and wisdom, the sum of experience. Having a better memory would mean knowing not only more about the world, but also more about myself. Surely some of the forgetting that seems to plague us is healthy and necessary. If I didn't forget so many of the dumb things I've done, I'd probably be unbearably neurotic. But how many worthwhile ideas have gone unthought and connections unmade because of my memory's shortcomings? I keep returning to something Ben Pridmore said in a newspaper interview, which made me ponder just how different his memory and my own might really be. It's all about technique and understanding how the memory works, he told the reporter. Anyone can do it, really. A couple weeks after my trip to the Weightlifting Hall of Fame, I stood in the back of an auditorium on the 19th floor of the Con Edison headquarters near Union Square in Manhattan. An observation at the 2005 U.S. Memory Championship. Spurred by my fascination with Ben Pridmore, I was there to write a short piece for Slate magazine about what I imagined would be the Super Bowl of savants. The scene I stumbled on, however, was something less than a clash of titans. A bunch of guys and a few ladies, widely varying in both age and hygienic upkeep, poring over pages of random numbers and long lists of words. They referred to themselves as mental athletes, or just MAs for short. There were 5 events. First, the contestants had to learn by heart a 50-line unpublished poem called The Tapestry of Me. Then, they were provided with 99 photographic headshots, accompanied by first and last names, and given 15 minutes to memorize as many of them as possible. They had another 15 minutes to memorize a list of 300 random words, 5 minutes to memorize a page of 1,000 random digits, 25 lines of numbers, 40 numbers to a line, and another 5 minutes to learn the order of a shuffled deck of playing cards. Among the competitors were 2 of the world's 36 Grand Masters of Memory, a rank attained by memorizing a sequence of 1,000 random digits in under an hour. the precise order of 10 shuffled decks of playing cards in the same amount of time, and the order of one shuffled deck in less than 2 minutes. Though, on the face of it, these feats might seem like little more than geeky party tricks, essentially useless, and perhaps even vaguely pathetic. What I discovered as I talked to the competitors was something far more serious, a story that made me reconsider the limits of my own mind and the very essence of my education. I asked Ed Cook, a young grandmaster from England who had come to the U.S. event as spring trainer for the summer's World Championship. Since he was a non-American, his scores couldn't be counted in the U.S. contest. When he first realized he was a savant, "Oh, I'm not a savant," he said, chuckling. Oh wait, he's from England. Let's give him an England accent. "Oh, I'm not a savant," he said, chuckling. "Photographic memory?" I asked. He chuckled again. "Photographic memory is a detestable myth," he said. "Doesn't exist. In fact, my memory is quite average. All of us here have average memories." That seemed hard to square with the fact that I just watched him recite back 252 random digits as effortlessly as if they had been his own telephone number. "What you have to understand is that even average memories are remarkably powerful if used properly," he said. Ed had a blocky face and a shoulder-length mop of curly brown hair, and could be counted among the competitors who were least concerned with habits of personal grooming. He was wearing a suit with a loosened tie and incongruously a pair of flip-flops, emblazoned with the Union Jacket. He was 24 years old, but carried his body like someone 3 times that age. He hobbled about with a cane at his side. A winning prop, he called it, which was necessitated by a recent painful relapse of chronic juvenile arthritis. He and all the other mental athletes I met kept insisting, as Ben Pridmore had in his interview, that anyone could do what they do. It was simply a matter of learning to think in more memorable ways, using the extraordinarily simple 2,500-year-old mnemonic technique known as the memory palace that Simonius of Cleos had supposedly invented in the rubble of the great banquet hall collapse. The techniques of the memory palace, also known as the journey method or the method of Loki, and more broadly as the ars memorativia or art of memory, were refined and codified in the extensive set of rules and instruction manuals by Romans like Cicero and Quintilian, and flowered in the Middle Ages as a way for the pious to memorize everything from sermons and prayers to the punishments awaiting the wicked in hell. These were the same tricks that the Roman senators had used to memorize their speeches, and the Athenian statesmen, Themistocles, had supposedly used to memorize the names of 20,000 Athenians, and that medieval scholars had used to memorize entire books. Ed explained to me that the competitors saw themselves as participants in an amateur research program. Whose aim was to rescue a long-lost tradition of memory training that had disappeared centuries ago. Once upon a time, Ed insisted remembering was everything. A trained memory was not just a handy tool, but a fundamental facet of any worldly man. What's more, memory training was considered a form of character building, a way of developing the cardinal virtue of prudence, and by extension, ethics. Only through memorizing the thinking went could ideas truly be incorporated into one's psyche, and their values absorbed. The techniques existed not just to memorize useless information, like decks of playing cards, but also to etch into the brain foundational texts and ideas. But then in the 15th century, Gutenberg came along and turned books into mass-produced commodities, and eventually it was no longer all that important to remember what the printed page could remember for you. Memory techniques that had once been a staple of classical and medieval culture got wrapped up with the occult and esoteric. Hermetic traditions of the Renaissance, and by the 19th century, they had been relegated to carnival sideshows and tacky self-help books, only to be resurrected in the last decade of the 20th century for this bizarre and singular competition. The leader of this renaissance in memory thinking and training is a slick 67-year-old British educator and self-styled guru named Tony Boulzon. Who claims to have the highest creativity quotient in the world. When I met him in the cafeteria of the Coin Edison building, he was wearing a navy suit with 5 enormous gold-rimmed buttons and a collarless shirt with another large button at his throat that gave him the air of Eastern priest. A neuron-shaped pin adorned his label. His watch faced bore in reproduction of Dali's Persistence of Memory, the one with the dripping watch face. He referred to the competitors as warriors of the mind. Boulzon's grizzled face looked a decade older than his 67 years, but the rest of him was as trim as a 30-year-old. He rows between 6 and 10 kilometers every morning on the river Thames, he told me, and he makes a point of eating lots of brain-healthy vegetables and fish. Junk food in, junk brain. Healthy food in, healthy brain, he said. When he walked, Boulzon seemed to glide across the floor like an air hockey puck. The result, he later told me, of 40 years training in the Alexander technique. When he spoke, he gesticulated with a polished staccato precision that could only have been honed in front of a mirror. That could only have been honed in front of a mirror. Often he punctuated a key point with an explosion of fingers from his closed fist. Boulzon founded the World Memory Championship in 1991. Oh, that was the year I was born. Wow. And has since established national championship in more than a dozen countries, from China to South Africa to Mexico. He says he has been working with a missionary zeal since the 1970s to get these memory techniques implemented in schools around the world. He calls it a global education revolution, focusing on learning how to learn. And he's been minting himself a serious fortune in the process. According to press reports, Michael Jackson ran up a $3,043,000 bill, $300,000 bill, excuse me, sorry, for Boulzon's mind-boosting services shortly before his death. Boulzon believes schools go about teaching all wrong. They pour vast amounts of information into students' heads, but don't teach them how to retain it. Memorizing has gotten a bad rap as a mindless way of holding on to facts just long enough to pass the next exam. But it's not memorization that's evil, he said. It's the tradition of boring, rote learning that he believes has corrupted Western education. What we have been doing over the last century is defining memory incorrectly, understanding it incompletely, applying it inappropriately, and condemning it because it doesn't work and isn't enjoyable. Boulzon argues, if rote memorization is a way of scratching impressions into our brains through the brute force of repetition, the old drill and kill method, then the art of memory is a more elegant way of remembering through technique. It is faster, less painful, and produces longer-lasting memories, Boulzon told me. The brain is like a muscle, he said, and the memory training is a form of mental workout. Over time, like any form of exercise, it'll make the brain fitter, quicker, and more nimble. It's an idea that dates back to the very origins of memory training. Roman orators argued that the art of memory, the proper retention and ordering of knowledge, was a vital instrument for the invention of new ideas. Today, the mental workout has gained great currency in the popular imagination. Brain gyms and memory boot camps are a growing fad, and brain training software was a 265 million industry in 2008. No doubt in part because of research that shows that older people who keep their minds active with crossword puzzles and chess can stave off Alzheimer's and progressive dementia. But mostly because of baby boomer generation's intense insecurity about losing their marbles. But while there is much solid science to back up the dementia-defying benefits of an active brain, Boulzon's most hyperbolic claims about the collateral effects of brain exercise should inspire a measured dose, at least, of skepticism. Nevertheless, it was hard to argue with these results. I just watched a 47-year-old competitor recite in order a list of 100 random words he'd learned a few minutes earlier. Boulzon was eager to sell me on the idea that his own memory has been improving after year, even as he ages. People assume that memory decline is a function of being human, and therefore natural, he said. But that is a logical error, because normal is not necessarily natural. The reason for the monitored decline in human memory performance is because we actually do anti-Olympic training. What we do to the brain is the equivalent of sitting someone down to train for the Olympics and making sure he drinks 10 cans of beer a day, smokes 50 cigarettes, drives to work, and maybe does some exercise once a month that's violent and damaging, and spends the rest of time watching TV. And then we wonder why that person doesn't do well in the Olympics. That's what we've been doing with memory. I pestered Boulzon about how hard it would be to learn these techniques. How did the competitors train? How quickly did their memories improve? Did they use techniques in everyday life? If they were really as simple and effective as he was claiming, how come I'd never heard of them before? Why weren't we all using them? You know, he replied, instead of asking me all these questions, you should just try it for yourself. What would it take, theoretically, for someone like me to train for the U.S. Memory Championship? I asked him. If you want to make it to the top of the 3 of the U.S. Championship, it'd be a good idea to spend an hour a day, 6 days a week. If you spend that much time, you do very well. If you wanted to enter the World Championship, you'd need to spend 3 to 4 hours a day for the final 6 months leading up to the championship. It gets heavy. Later that morning, while the competitors were trying to memorize the tapestry of me, Boulzon took me aside and put his hand on my shoulder. Remember our little talk. Think about it. That could be you up there on the stage at the next U.S. Memory Championship. During a break between the poem memorization and the names and faces event, I headed for the sidewalk outside the Con Ed building to escape the locker room humidity. There I ran into a mop-haired, cane-totting English memorist, Ed Cook, and his lanky sidekick, the Austrian Grand Master, Lucas Amas, rolling their own cigarette. Ed had graduated from Oxford and previously spring with a first-class degree in psychology and physiology, and told me that he was simultaneously toying with writing a book titled The Art of Introspection. Pursuing his cognitive science PhD at the University of Paris, where he was doing ultra research with the aim of making people feel like their body has shrunk to 1/10 of its normal size. He was also working on inventing a new color. Not just a new color, but a whole new way of seeing color. Lucas, at University of Vienna law student who had advertised himself as the author of a short pamphlet titled, How to Be 3 Times Cleverer Than Your IQ, was leaning against the building, trying to justify to Ed his miserable showing in the Random Words event. I've never even heard of these English words, yawn, ulcer, and asile before, he insisted in a stiff Austrian accent. How can I be expected to memorize them? At the time, Ed and Lucas were respectively the 11th and 9th best memorizers in the world. The only Grand Masters at the event, and the only competitors who had shown up in suit and tie. They were eager to share with me or anyone their plan to cash in on their memories and their memoric fame by building a memory gymnasium called the Oxford Mind Academy. Their idea was that subscribers, mostly business executives, they hoped would pay to have personal mental workout trainers once the world learned the benefits of training one's memory. They imagined that cash would fall from the sky. Ultimately, Ed told me, we are looking to rehabilitate Western education, which we considered to be degenerate, Lucas added. Ed explained to me that he saw his participation in memory competitions as part of his attempt to unravel the secrets of human memory. I figured that these 2 ways of figuring out how the brain works I figured that there are 2 ways of figuring out how the brain works, he said. The first is the way that empirical psychology does it, which is that you look from the outside and take a load of measurements on a load of different people. The other way follows the form the logic that a system's optimal performance can tell you something about its design. Perhaps the best way to understand human memory is to try very hard to optimize it, ideally with a load of bright people in conditions where they get rigorous and objective feedback. That's what the memory circuit is. The contest itself unfolded with all the excitement of, say, the SAT. The contestants sat quietly at tables, staring at sheets of paper. then scribbled answers that they handed off to judges. After each event, scores were quickly calculated and displayed on a screen at the front of the room. But much to the dismay of a journalist trying to write about the National Memory Championship, the sport had none of the public agony of a baseball game, or even a spelling bee. Sometimes it was difficult to tell whether competitors were deep in thought or asleep. They may have been a lot of dramatic temple massaging and nervous foot tapping, and the occasional empty stare of defeat. But mostly the drama was inside of the competitors' heads and inaccessible to spectators. A troubling thought percolated to the front of my brain as I stood in the back of the Con Edison building, which these supposedly normal human beings perform their almost unfathomable mental aerobics. I didn't have a clue on how my own memory worked. Was there even such a place as the front of my brain? A slow wave of questions swept over me, things I'd never bothered to wonder about, which all of a sudden seemed profoundly pressing. What exactly is a memory? How is one created? And how does it get stored? I'd spent the first 2.5 decades of my life with a memory that operated so seamlessly that I'd never had cause to stop and inquire about its mechanics. And yet now that I was stopping to think about it, I realized that it actually didn't work all that seamlessly. It completely failed in certain areas and worked far too well in others, and it had so many inexplicable quirks. That very morning, my brain had been held hostage by an unbearable Britney Spears song, forcing me to spend the better part of the subway ride humming Hakuna jingles in the attempt to dislodge it. Hanukkah jingles in an attempt to dislodge it. What was that about? A few days earlier, I had been trying to tell a friend about an author I admired, only to find that I remembered the first letter of his name and nothing else. How come that happened? And why didn't I have a single memory before the age of 3? For that matter, why couldn't I remember what I had for breakfast just the day before? Even though I remembered exactly what I was having for breakfast, corn pups, coffee, and a banana 4 years earlier when I was told that a plane had just crashed into one of the Twin Towers. And why am I always forgetting why I opened the refrigerator door? I came away from the U.S. Memory Championship eager to find out how Ed and Lucas did it. Were these just extraordinary individuals, prodigies from the long trail of humanity's bell curve? Or was there something we could all learn from their talents? I was skeptical about them for the same reason I was skeptical about Tony Boulzon, any self-appointed guru who has earned himself a king's ransom in the modern self-help racket is bound to perk up a journalist's bullshit detector. And Boulzon had set off every alarm bell I've got. I didn't yet know enough to know whether he was selling hype or science, but his over-the-top packaging, a global education revolution, certainly smacked of the former. Was it really true that anyone could learn to quickly memorize huge quantities of information? Anyone? I was willing to believe Boulzon when he said there were techniques that one could learn to marginally improve one's memory around the edges, but I didn't fully believe him or Ed when he said that any schmo off the street, that any schmo off the street could learn to memorize entire decks of playing cards or thousands of binary digits. The alternate explanation just seemed a whole lot more plausible. That Ed and his colleagues had some freakish innate talent that was the mental equivalent of Andrea the Giant's height or Usain Bolt's legs. Indeed, much of what's been written about memory improvement by self-help gurus is tainted by hucksterism. When I checked out the self-help aisle at my local Barnes & Noble, I found stacks of books marketing fervid claims that they could teach me how to never forget a telephone number or date, or develop instant recall. One book even pronounced that it could show me how to use the other 90% of my brain, which is one of those placebo scientific cliches that makes about as much sense as saying I could be taught to use the other 90% of my hands. But memory improvement has also long been investigated by people whose relationship to the subject are less obviously profitable and whose claims are inspected by peer review. Academic psychologists have been interested in expanding our native memory capacities ever since Hermann Ebbinghaus first brought the study of memory into the laboratory in 1870s. In the 1870s. This book is about the year I spent trying. This book is about the year I spent trying to train my memory, and also trying to understand it, its inner workings, its natural deficiencies, its hidden potential. It's about how I learned firsthand that our memories are indeed improvable within limits, and that the skills of Ed and Lucas can indeed be tapped by all of us. It's also about the scientific study of expertise, and how researchers who study memory champions have discovered general principles of skill acquisition, secrets to improving at just about anything, from how mental athletes train their brains. Through this is excuse me. Though this is not meant to be a self-help book, I hope you'll come away with a sense of how one goes about training one's memory, and about how memory techniques can be used in everyday life. Those techniques have a surprisingly rich and important legacy. The role that they have played in the development of Western culture is one of the great themes in intellectual history, whose story is not widely known outside of the rarefied academic corners in which it is studied. Mnemonic systems like Simonides memory palace profoundly shaped the way people approached the world from the time of antiquity through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And then they all but disappeared. Psychologically, we are virtually identical to our ancestors who painted images of a bison on the walls of the Loups cave in France, among the earliest culture artifacts to have survived to the present day. Our brains are no larger or more sophisticated than theirs. If one of their babies were to be dropped into the arms of an adoptive parent in the 21st century New York, the child would likely grow up indistinguishable from his or her peers. All that differentiates us from them is our memories, not the memories that reside in our own brains, for the child born today enters the world just as much as a blank slate as the child born 30,000 years ago, but rather the memories that are stored outside of ourselves, in books, photographs, museums, and these days, a digital media. Once upon a time, memory was at the root of all culture. But over the last 30 millennia, since human beings painting their memories on cave walls, we've gradually supplanted our own natural memory with the vast superstructure of external memory aids, a process that has sped up exponentially in recent years. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that all the world's ink had become invisible and all our bytes had disappeared. Our world would immediately crumble. Literature, music, law, politics, science, math, our culture in an edifice built of external memories. If memory is our means of preserving that which we consider most valuable, it is also painfully linked to our own transcendence. When we die, our memories die with us, in a sense. The elaborate system of externalized memory we've created is a way of fending off mortality. It allows ideas to be efficiently passed across time and space, and for one idea to build on another to a degree not possible when a thought has to be passed from brain to brain in order to be sustained. The externalization of memory not only changed how people think, it also led to a profound shift in the very notion of what it means to be intelligent. Internal memory became devalued. Erodation evolved from the possessing information internally to the knowing how and where to find it in the labyrinth world of external memory. It's a telling statement that pretty much the only place where you'll find people still training their memories is at the World Memory Championship and the dozen national memory contests held around the globe. What was once a cornerstone of Western culture is now, at best, a curiosity. But as our culture has transformed from one that was fundamentally based on internal memories to one that is fundamentally based on memories stored outside the brain, what are the implications for ourselves and for our society? What we've gained is indisputable. But what have we traded away? What does it mean that we've lost our memory? And that's the end of the first chapter. Let's see what people have said. Oh, hi! Hi, Maddie Legend. No, I was reading today. Ariel Brook Moon, hi. Emily 1602, thank you for the flowers. And thank you for the follow. Well, I'm going to end that there, because I'm going to end them at the end of each chapter. I might upload them to my YouTube channel, so I'll end it there. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. You guys like my funny glasses?